Baby, he's never going to find out. He's just a construction worker. What's he going to do? Go check the walls. Laughter drifted through the door. Light, easy, the kind of laugh that belongs to a person who has never once given serious thought to consequences. I was standing 14 inches from that door, a sealed white envelope in my left hand. DNA results from GenPath Diagnostics. Charlotte, North Carolina, 99.9% accuracy. Printed in clean black type on a page I had read 11 times since the email arrived. I had been holding that document for 6 hours and 41 minutes. My hand had not trembled once. The laughter stopped. My name is Baron Wells. I am 39 years old. For 14 years, I have been restoring historic structures in the Cherry neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina foundations. Load-bearing walls, timber framing laid down before my grandfather was born. I have never once broken ground without first checking what was underneath it. A man who pours concrete over a compromised foundation is not building anything. He is only choosing the moment it falls. What I held in my hand that Tuesday morning in March was the result of 18 months of work done in total silence. The kind of labor that people like her had stopped seeing long before any of this began because they had stopped looking. Before this story goes any further, hit like, subscribe to this channel, and leave me a comment right now telling me where in the world you are and what time it is where you are. I want to know who is out there with me tonight. Let's go back to the beginning. The alarm on my phone went off at 5:15 every morning, but most days I was already awake before it. Old habit from my first years in the trade, back when I was working 6 days a week for a restoration company out of Concord and had to be on the highway before sunrise. Ariana used to tease me about it. She would roll over in the dark and say, "Baron, the house is not going anywhere," and I would laugh and pull the covers up around her and go downstairs to make coffee. I missed those mornings. Not in a way I talked about, just in the way a man notices when a room that used to feel warm has gradually, without any announcement, gone cold. By the time this story begins, Ariana and I had been married 9 years. I was 37. She was 34. VP of Strategic Acquisitions at Meridian Development Group, one of the mid-size commercial real estate firms, quietly reshaping the east side of Charlotte for the better part of a decade. She was good at her job, sharp, organized, the kind of person who walked into a room and understood the power structure before she had taken off her coat. I had loved that about her from the first night we met, at a fundraiser for the Levine Museum of the New South, when she pointed at a development proposal on a display board and explained its structural flaws with more clarity than half the engineers I had worked with. We talked until the lights came up at the end of the evening. I asked for her number before she had a chance to say goodbye. The Brianna I fell in love with wore her hair natural, drove a 4-year-old Honda Accord, and made the best shrimp and grits in Mecklenburg County on Sunday mornings, while gospel played from the Bluetooth speaker on the kitchen counter. She laughed at her own jokes. She called her grandmother every Thursday without fail. She had a way of listening when you spoke that made you feel like the only person in the room, not because she performed it, but because she actually meant it. That woman did not disappear overnight. That is the part people get wrong when they talk about how marriages change. They imagine a door slamming, mucks, a line crossed, a before and after clean enough to mark on a calendar. It is almost never that. It is more like what I see sometimes when I am opening a wall in a structure that looks solid from the outside. The surface is fine, the paint is intact, and then you pull back the drywall and find the wood behind it has been damp for years. The damage is not new. It is just newly visible. The Cherry neighborhood had been my whole professional world for most of those 14 years. And I want to tell you a little about it so you understand what was at stake. Cherry is one of the oldest black residential neighborhoods in Charlotte. Settled in the late 1800s, a community of craftsman bungalows and federal-style row houses and old brick commercial buildings that had survived annexation pressures and urban renewal, and decades of disinvestment that had taken apart neighborhoods like it all across the South. The people who lived there had fought for every block. The church mothers at Third Ward Baptist, the old men who sat on their porches on Brevard Street and remembered when every business in a 4-block radius was black-owned. The younger families who had moved back in the past decade because they wanted their children to grow up somewhere. With roots, all of them had trusted me with the structures their lives were built around. That trust was not given easily, and it was not given quickly. I had earned it one careful project at a time over 14 years. It was the most valuable professional asset I possessed. I want you to hold on to that, because it becomes important later. The first thing I noticed about Ariana's change was the password on her phone. We had never made rules about each other's devices. It had never seemed necessary. One evening in September, I picked up her phone to show her a photo from the job site, and the screen asked for a 6-digit code. I put the phone down without saying anything. It was the kind of thing that could mean nothing. I understood that. But in 14 years of construction work, I had learned not to dismiss the first sign of movement in a structure, no matter how small. The second thing was a name. Marcus Holt, senior partner, Meridian Development Group. He had joined the company 8 months earlier from a firm in Atlanta, and his name had begun appearing with increasing frequency in Ariana's daily conversation, always casually, always framed as professional context, but with a regularity that had a shape to it. Marcus thinks the East Trade Street project could be repositioned. Marcus has a contact at the county planning office who might be useful. Marcus and I are presenting to the Ballantine corporate board next week. I was not counting the references. I did not need to count. I had spent too many years reading structures to miss a pattern when it was establishing itself in front of me. The third thing was a Friday evening in late October, when she came home 2 hours later than she had told me and walked past me in the kitchen, without stopping to say hello, and I caught, just briefly, the edge of a cologne I did not recognize. Not strong, not obvious, just there the way a hairline crack is just there in the corner of a wall, small enough that most people look right past it. I stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment after she went upstairs. I did not say anything that night. Then one evening in November, Ariana came home from a Meridian strategy dinner and walked through the kitchen, where I was finishing up site drawings at the table. She barely glanced over. "You're still working on that Cherry proposal," she said. Not with interest, with the particular flat tone of a person describing something that no longer quite registers as significant. 14 months in, I said. She opened the refrigerator. Marcus says the city is looking at larger institutional partners for projects at that scale. She poured herself a glass of water. It might be worth being realistic about what a company your size can actually win. I looked at her. She was already scrolling her phone with her other hand, the water glass halfway to her mouth, her attention already somewhere else. I turned back to my drawings. The thing about invisible labor fatigue. The psychological weight that accumulates in a person who carries a partnership alone, unseen and unthanked, is that it does not announce itself. It settles in slowly, over months and years, in the small accumulations of a life, where one person keeps showing up, and the other has begun treating that showing up as something owed rather than given. I had been the one who remembered her mother's birthday, and the oil change on her car, and the anniversary service at Third Ward Baptist where her grandmother had been a member for 41 years. I had taken off work for the plumber and sat in waiting rooms and fixed the back fence after the storm in July. None of it was loud. None of it was performed. I did it because I believed that was what love looked like when you stripped away the noise. Not speeches, not grand gestures, but the ordinary faithfulness of someone who had decided every single morning to keep showing up. What I had not understood was that by the time devaluation cycling sets in that slow, grinding pattern where one partner begins to diminish the other's worth in small daily ways, often without fully realizing they are doing it, the invisible labor has usually already become invisible to the person it was done for. They have stopped seeing it, not out of cruelty necessarily, out of habit. And habit, given enough time, looks exactly like indifference. I kept showing up, but I started keeping track. There was a particular evening in October that I returned to more than any other from that period. A Thursday. Ariana had come home from work at 7:15, which was not unusual. I had dinner on the stove, chicken and rice, nothing complicated, and she sat at the kitchen table and looked at her phone while I finished cooking and plated the food and brought it over. We ate. She talked about a meeting she had attended and a zoning issue on a project in Steel Creek and a colleague who had handled a client call badly. I listened. I asked questions. I cleared the plates. At some point, she looked up and said, "You know, Marcus took the entire team to dinner at Kindred last week just to celebrate closing the Uptown parking deck deal. He understands what it means to make people feel valued." I was standing at the sink with my back to her. I said, "That sounds like a good evening." She made a small sound that might have been agreement and went back to her phone. I stood at the sink and rinsed the plates and thought about the Sunday mornings I had gotten up at 6 to fix the hot water heater before she woke up. The Saturday in January I had spent 7 hours replacing the rotted subflooring under the master bathroom while she was at her sister's. The February afternoon I had driven 40 minutes each way to pick up her mother from a hair appointment because Ariana had a work conflict, and her mother did not like to drive on the highway. The precise and absolute invisibility of all of it. Devaluation cycling is not always loud. It does not always come with contempt and raised voices, and the kind of cruelty that is recognizable from the outside. Sometimes it is this: a man standing at a sink rinsing plates while his wife describes another man's generosity as a standard he ought to aspire to, and the man says nothing because he has learned somewhere along the way that saying something would only become evidence of his inadequacy rather than evidence of the damage being done. I rinsed the last plate and dried my hands and told her I had some drawings to review and went to the study and closed the door. I opened the spreadsheet. I added a new row. I noted the time and the date and what had been said and the specific emotional texture of the moment. Then I went back to the cherry proposal drawings and worked for 2 hours and went to bed. I kept showing up, but I stopped talking about the things that mattered. Not because I had given up, because I was using the energy for something else. Something that required patience. Something that required me to see clearly and move only when the picture was complete. I am not a man who moves on emotion. The people who know me well understand this as a feature, not a flaw. An engineer who panics when a beam gives way is an engineer who makes catastrophic decisions. At the exact moment precision is most required. The correct response to discovering a problem in a structure is not to tear down the whole building. The correct response is to assess the load, identify the precise failure point, and determine exactly how much weight the remaining structure can bear. My marriage was a structure. I was not ready to condemn it, not yet, but I needed to understand what I was actually looking at. I started with the finances. On a Friday night in early November, I opened a personal spreadsheet and began going through 3 months of statements on our shared accounts. Nothing criminal announced itself immediately, but there were dinner charges at 2 restaurants I had never been to, and a Marriott receipt dated on a Tuesday night, when Ariana had told me she was at a company retreat in Raleigh. The Marriott was on South Tryon Street, 11 minutes from our house in Dilworth. I wrote down the amounts, the dates, the locations. I noted the gaps between when she said she would be home and when her key actually turned in the lock. I did not confront her. Strategic equanimity is not passivity, it is the deliberate choice to collect complete information before making any move, because a partial case is not a case at all. In construction, you do not stop a foundation pour halfway through and walk away. You either commit to doing it right or you do not begin. I found attorney Nasir Cole through a colleague whose brother had gone through a difficult custody proceeding the year before. Nazir's office was on East Moorhead Street, a third-floor walk-up above a Caribbean restaurant, with 2 diplomas from North Carolina Central University on the wall and a desk stacked with thick manila folders in a system that appeared chaotic until he explained its internal logic to you. He was 46, careful with his words, the kind of man who listened until you had fully stopped speaking before he offered anything in response. I laid out everything I had in a Monday afternoon meeting that lasted just under 2 hours. When I was done, he set his pen down. "Document everything," he said. "Not what you believe, what you can demonstrate." I also retained a private investigator named Douglas from a firm on Wilkinson Boulevard. He was 61, a former Mecklenburg County Sheriff's deputy, and he communicated exclusively in short, factual texts and left emotion entirely outside his reports. Over 3 weeks, he confirmed what the hotel receipt had already suggested. Marcus Holt and my wife had been meeting privately, outside of work hours and away from Meridian's offices on at least 6 documented occasions over the previous 4 months. 3 of those occasions involved restaurant reservations made under a name I recognized as Marcus's middle name. One involved a weekend conference in Asheville, where Ariana had told me she was attending alone. The evidence was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It was simply real, and real was all I had ever required. Douglas's reports were clinical documents. No editorializing, no emotional language, no conclusions drawn beyond what the facts warranted. The third report arrived on a Wednesday morning in early January and documented a 4-hour period, the previous Saturday afternoon, during which Marcus Holt and Ariana had met at a coffee house on Montfort Drive and then walked 3 blocks to a residential building on Kenilworth. Douglas had photographs of the exterior, only he was precise about the limits of what he was paid to do, and a timestamp log and the address. That was enough. I read the report twice at my kitchen table, with my coffee going cold beside my right hand. I folded it in thirds and put it in the expandable folder that was living at the back of my desk drawer, behind the project invoices and the material receipts. Then I got up and poured the cold coffee down the drain, and made a fresh cup and drove to the Cherry site and spent the morning on a second-floor, subflooring repair that required the kind of focused physical attention that did not leave room for other things. There is a phenomenon in structural engineering called progressive collapse, the sequential failure of load-bearing elements, in which one failure triggers the next until the entire system gives way. The thing that had been happening in my marriage over the preceding months was its emotional equivalent. One silence leading to another, one absence becoming the precedent for the next. Neither event dramatic enough on its own to name as a crisis. But the cumulative load had been building for a long time, and I had understood since at least November that the structure was no longer sustainable. The question was not whether it would come down. The question was how I chose to stand when it did. I chose to stand exactly where I had always stood, on solid ground, with documentation. The private investigator's work concluded at the end of January. Douglas delivered his final report in person at a gas station on Wilkinson Boulevard, his preferred method for final deliveries, for reasons he never explained and I never asked about. 7 pages, factual, complete. I signed off on the final invoice and shook his hand and drove back to the site. Everything I needed was now in the expandable folder. The financial records, Douglas's reports, the communications that Nasir had obtained through the legal discovery process. 18 months of quiet, careful, invisible work. The most important project I had ever undertaken, and one that would never appear in any company portfolio. And then, on a Wednesday evening, in the second week of December, Ariana set a pregnancy test on the kitchen counter. She was looking at me with an expression I could not fully read, partly cautious, partly something that was managing itself, even as she presented it. The specific face of a person who is sharing information and simultaneously monitoring the response to it. She had always been skilled at managing responses. "We're going to have a baby," she said. I looked at the test. 2 lines, clear and definite. I looked at her. I said, "That's incredible news," and I meant to sound warm. And I think I came close enough. Inside, I was already counting. The obstetrician's estimate, based on the test results, and what Ariana had told her about her most recent cycle, placed the pregnancy at between 14 and 16 weeks gestation. I had the arithmetic done before she finished her next sentence. The last time Ariana and I had been intimate was 11 weeks earlier, on a Thursday night in late September. Not an approximation. A fact I held with the same precision I hold the load specifications of the structures I work on. The numbers did not match. The cognitive dissonance that follows a moment. Like that, the grinding internal collision between what you know and what you need not to be true, between the evidence in front of you and the life you believed you were living, does not resolve quickly. It settles in the chest like a structural fault that has not yet fully propagated. You feel it shifting. You cannot unsee it. But the wall is still standing, and some part of you needs it to remain standing just a little longer while you figure out your next move. I did not say anything that night. I held her. I lay in the dark afterward, staring at the ceiling, and listened to her breathing slow into sleep, and thought about the first Sunday morning. She had made shrimp and grits while the kitchen filled with gospel music, and how I had stood in the doorway watching her, and thought that I had somehow managed to build the best possible life. The following morning I called Nasir Cole from my truck before I drove to the site. I want to stop here, because what comes next is something I believe every person listening should understand, not just because of what it meant in my particular situation, but because knowledge is protection. And the more clearly you understand how these processes work, the harder it is for anyone to use your ignorance as a weapon against you. A non-invasive prenatal paternity test, known by the medical abbreviation NIP, is a DNA-based procedure that can be performed as early as 7 weeks into a pregnancy. It works by analyzing fragments of the baby's genetic material that circulate freely in the mother's bloodstream throughout gestation, a phenomenon called cell-free fetal DNA. The process requires only 2 things: a standard blood draw from the mother and a cheek swab from the alleged father. It is performed at an AAB-accredited laboratory, meaning the facility has been independently certified for accuracy and chain of custody protocol. The accuracy rate is 99.9%. Results take between 5 and 7 business days from receipt of the samples. There is no surgical component and no risk whatsoever to the pregnancy. In North Carolina, under Chapter 49 of the General Statutes, a husband is presumed by law to be the legal father of any child born during the marriage. That legal presumption can be challenged through a civil proceeding, but the standard pathway for court-ordered paternity in the state generally requires waiting until after the birth. The NIP test is therefore the option available to a man in my position who needs an answer during a pregnancy, but it requires the mother's voluntary participation, since her blood draw is a necessary component of the analysis. What this meant practically was that I had a decision to make. I could wait until after the birth and pursue a legal paternity determination through the courts, which would be slow and adversarial and very public in a way I was not yet ready for. Or I could approach Ariana directly, present what I had already gathered, and ask for her voluntary cooperation with the prenatal test, knowing that her response to that request would itself tell me something important about what I was dealing with. I chose to wait, not because I lacked the will to act, because I was not yet finished building the case I needed, and a man who moves before his foundation is set is a man who loses everything when the load shifts. December came and went. January. I watched Ariana manage her pregnancy the way she managed everything else in her life, with a careful, controlled efficiency. Scheduling appointments, researching nurseries, calling her mother with a joy that was present but slightly staged around the edges, the way a contractor stages a space before the final inspection. I kept adding to the spreadsheet. I kept receiving Douglas's reports, brief and factual, and getting no less significant as the weeks passed. I kept my conversations with Nazir transactional and disciplined. What I was watching for was the moment when the weight of what she was carrying would show itself in some structural way. A shift in her posture, a hesitation in a response. The specific kind of tell that appears in a person who has been managing a significant concealment for a long time and is beginning to feel the load. I had learned in 14 years of working on old buildings that a structure under hidden stress will always eventually communicate where the problem is. You simply have to be patient enough and present enough to read it. In the second week of February, my sister Zuri called me from her office on East 7th Street. She had inherited from our father the specific gift of knowing when a column of numbers contained something wrong before she could articulate precisely what it was. "I need to talk to you," she said, "not on the phone." She came over that Thursday evening with a small silver USB drive that she set on my kitchen table without any setup or preamble. 5 months, she said. I have been holding this 5 months. I think now is the right time. But we will come back to what was on that drive. Because before I can tell you what Zuri had been quietly carrying since September, I need to tell you what happened first, on a Friday evening, in March At the Ballantine Hotel the night that everything that had been building beneath the surface finally and permanently came to the top. If you were in my position, knowing everything I knew, holding everything I held, would you have confronted Ariana months earlier, the moment you understood what was happening? Or would you have waited the way I did until the case was complete and unassailable? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because the way a person answers that question says something real about who they are and how they move through the hardest moments of their life. The annual Meridian Development Group Corporate Gala was held on a Friday evening in March at the Ballantine Hotel on Ballantine Corporate Place. Crystal chandeliers throwing warm gold light across white tablecloths. About 200 people in formal dress, moving through the room with the particular ease of people who have never once had to explain their right to be somewhere. I had received the DNA results at 6:47 that evening. I was in the small dressing room off the hotel lobby, my vest half-buttoned, when the notification arrived from GenPath Diagnostics. I opened the email on my phone. I read the document once, slowly. I read it again. Then I sat down on the bench along the wall and looked at the marble floor for a while without seeing it. The ventilation system hummed steadily overhead. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. Then I stood up, finished buttoning my vest, squared my shoulders, and walked out. Before I walked through those doors, I stood outside on the concrete plaza for approximately 4 minutes. The March air was cool and dry. The kind of evening in Charlotte when the sky holds its color late into the 7 o'clock hour. I could see the lobby light through the glass, the movement of formal dress inside, the particular choreography of a corporate social event that has been running long enough for people to relax into it. I thought about the DNA document folded in the inside pocket of my jacket. I'd spent 18 months building something that could not be argued, with evidence so complete and so precisely organized that it did not require my emotional participation to make its case. That was the principle I had worked from the beginning. Not anger, not confrontation for its own sake, not the satisfaction of a scene, just the truth, properly documented, delivered, in the correct place, at the correct time to the correct audience. A man who builds structures for a living understands something about timing that people in other professions sometimes miss. The moment you introduce a load-bearing element, a column, a beam, a foundation pour, determines almost everything about the capacity of the system that follows. Move too early, and the material has not cured. Move too late, and the surrounding structure has already compensated in ways that make correction harder. There is a window. A careful man finds it and does not deviate from it. Tonight was the window. I straightened my jacket. I pressed my hand once, briefly, against the outside of my chest where the envelope was sitting in the inside pocket. Then I walked through the doors. The gala was in full movement when I arrived. I found my place at table 11 near the center of the room and made conversation with the people around me, an architect from STV Inc., a commercial developer whose firm had recently completed a mixed-use project in Noda, a representative from the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce who spoke about uptown revitalization with a civic passion that reminded me of why I had cared about this city's built environment for as long as I had. I was fully present. I was composed. I was also watching Marcus Holt work the room from across the ballroom, with the careful, peripheral attention I use when monitoring a section of a structure I am not yet certain about. Marcus Holt was 44 years old. He moved through a room the way men do when they have never once been made to feel. Their presence requires an apology. He wore his suit as if he had forgotten he was wearing it. He shook hands and touched elbows and received congratulations on the $47 million Cherry Neighborhood Urban Revitalization contract that Meridian had recently secured from the Charlotte City Council, and he received all of it with the practiced fluency of a man who had been performing his own confidence for so long he could no longer distinguish it from the genuine article. He gave a brief speech after dinner. He thanked the team. He spoke about strategic vision and long-term community investment in language that was smooth and rehearsed and empty at its center. At one point, his gaze moved across the room and rested on Ariana, who was seated near the west windows in a deep green dress, and the look lasted a half-second too long, the kind of duration that is not accidental. Several people at the tables between them noticed it. I noticed all of it. Ariana was 5 months along. She kept one hand on the table and the other in her lap, and smiled at the right moments in the right conversations. Her eyes never quite matched her smile. They had not matched it for a long time. I waited until Marcus left the podium and moved back toward his table near the east windows, table 7, where I had placed a sealed white envelope in the center of the white tablecloth before the dinner began, while the room was still being set and the staff were moving around the chairs, without paying any particular attention to one more man in formal dress, walking quietly between the tables. He did not see the envelope until he sat down. I walked across the room, pulled out the chair directly across from him, and sat down without asking. He looked at me. He looked at the envelope. A careful, practiced neutrality settled across his face, the professional composure of a man who had spent years in rooms where information moved fast, and showing your reaction first meant losing. I kept my voice low enough that only the people immediately adjacent to us could hear. At a table like this, populated by developers, 2 attorneys, and a representative from the Mecklenburg County Planning Office, that was exactly the audience that mattered. Those are DNA test results, I said. GenPath Diagnostics Charlotte. 99.9% accuracy. The child my wife is carrying is not mine. One beat. I thought you should know that before I speak to my attorney on Monday morning. He picked up the envelope. His hands were steady. Whatever else was true about Marcus Holt, he did not come apart easily in public. I'd gave him that. He drew the document halfway out and read the summary at the top of the first page. Something changed in his face. Not dramatically, more the way the exterior of a load-bearing wall looks in the moment. Before a crack propagates through it, the surface holds, but you can see the pressure behind it now. Moving. He set the document back inside the envelope. Baron, he started. You don't need to say anything tonight, I said. I stood and pushed the chair in carefully. Monday is soon enough. I walked away from that table without looking back. I crossed the ballroom in a straight line toward the exit. The nearest conversations quieted as I passed. Not because anything loud had happened, but because a room full of people trained to read power dynamics could sense that something significant had just been decided, and silence was the natural response. 8 steps from the door, her voice reached me. Baron, please stop. Ariana caught up with me in the hallway outside the ballroom. Her hand was on my arm. Her face had shed the careful presentation I had been watching all evening. What was there now was rawer and less organized, the expression of someone whose architecture has come down faster than they were prepared for. Listen to me, she said. I know how this looks. But if you give me 1 hour tonight, at home I will explain everything. Whatever you need from me, I will give it. I will fix this, Baron. We have a baby coming. We cannot just. I stopped walking. I turned and looked at her fully. She had both hands on my forearm now. Her eyes were bright and searching, and there was a genuine fear in them that I recognized as real, because I had known this woman's face for 9 years. And I knew the difference between the managed version and the one underneath it. But I also understood what I was looking at. Post-exposure, love-bombing, the sudden urgent flood of warmth and negotiation and feeling that arrives in the immediate aftermath of exposure is not the same thing as remorse. Remorse requires sitting with the actual shape of the damage you have caused long enough to see it clearly. What I was looking at was the survival impulse, not the reckoning. They wore a similar face. The bones underneath were entirely different. "Ariana," I said. My voice was level and quiet. "I have been watching this structure for 18 months. I know where every crack is and how deep each one goes. There is nothing left that requires explanation." I took my arm back gently. I walked to the valet stand and gave the attendant my ticket and stood outside in the March night air, hands in my pockets, while the city hummed its usual Friday noise around me. The drive home was 23 minutes. I turned the radio off 2 blocks from the hotel and drove in silence down Providence Road. And then south on Sharon, the Charlotte night spread wide and orange beyond the windshield. I thought about the first night I had driven Ariana home from a dinner in Midtown 9 years ago, the way she had looked out the passenger window at the spread of city lights and said, "I love this place. I love that it's still becoming something." I had thought about that sentence many times in the years since. I had never once stopped finding it true. Zuri was already at my house when I got home. She had let herself in, with the spare key she had held since our 20s, the one I gave her when our mother died. And she came to stay for 3 weeks, and we never discussed taking it back. She was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands round a mug of tea, and the silver USB drive was on the table in front of her. She looked up when I came through the door, read whatever was on my face, and did not ask how the evening had gone. "Sit down," she said. I sat. She told me she had been holding what was on that drive for 5 months. She had found the first piece of it through a former colleague who had moved to a commercial real estate consulting firm, a woman named Dominique, who had mentioned over lunch the previous September that Marcus Holt had been unusually well positioned for the Meridian Cherry project. Better positioned than should have been possible, Dominique had said. Given the number of competing bids, the complexity of the historic preservation requirements, and the institutional head start that a locally established firm like Wells Heritage already carried in that specific neighborhood. It had not made sense to Dominique from a competitive standpoint. She had said so to Zuri in passing and moved on. Zuri had not moved on. She had pulled the thread the way she pulled threads in audit work, slowly, methodically, without announcing herself, following the discrepancy wherever it led. Over 5 months, she had traced it to its source. What she found was this. In the spring of the previous year, Marcus Holt had identified the Charlotte City Council's Cherry Neighborhood Urban Revitalization Contract as the anchor deal of his tenure at Meridian. The project that would establish his regional reputation and justify the terms of his recruitment from Atlanta. The contract was $47 million, and it was complex in ways that made it genuinely difficult for an outside firm to compete. The historic preservation requirements referenced specific construction techniques and materials with a granularity that required on-the-ground knowledge of the neighborhood's existing building stock. The community stakeholder process required trust relationships with neighborhood associations and church leadership groups that had been built over decades and could not be manufactured quickly. The City Council's evaluation criteria explicitly weighted local expertise and community embeddedness. Wells Heritage Construction had all of those things. Our proposal, 14 months in development, was built on the specific technical knowledge I had accumulated over a decade and a half of working in that neighborhood knowledge of the individual structures, the soil conditions, the moisture patterns, the load histories of specific buildings, the specific community leaders, who had the trust of the neighborhood and whose endorsement carried weight with the council. Marcus had needed that knowledge, not in general. He had needed the specific contents of our proposal. He had obtained it from Ariana. I want to be careful and precise about what I mean when I say that, because the full truth here is more nuanced than simple theft and more instructive because of that nuance. What Marcus Holt had done is what researchers who study this behavioral pattern call targeted emotional exploitation, the deliberate identification of a person's specific emotional vulnerability, and the patient, strategic cultivation of proximity to that vulnerability for purposes of extraction. He had found a woman whose marriage had grown quiet and cold, whose professional ambitions had been slowly suffocating inside a partnership that had stopped being a true partnership, who felt unseen by the person who was supposed to see her most clearly. He had positioned himself as the person who saw her consistently, with patience, over months. And Ariana, inside the warmth and attention of what she genuinely believed was a relationship that valued her as she wanted to be valued, had spoken freely about her life, about her husband's work, about the cherry project that I had been developing with a focus and enthusiasm I did not often let myself show, because it represented everything I had been building towards since the company's first year. She had talked about the technical specifications I had walked her through on Sunday evenings, about the stakeholder contacts whose names I had mentioned when describing the community engagement process, about the pricing strategy I had explained to her at our kitchen table, because I had always believed in sharing what I was doing with the persons I was building a life with. She had not handed Marcus a file. She had simply talked openly, warmly, the way a person talks to someone they trust about the details of the life they share. She had not understood that every detail was being catalogued. Marcus Holt had used the specific contents of those conversations to build a competing proposal that addressed the historic preservation requirements with technical specificity that his team could not have assembled independently, that named the correct community stakeholders and framed the engagement process in the precise language that would resonate with the council's evaluation criteria, and that priced the contract in the range that our own figures had established as the viable competitive window. Wells Heritage Construction had received a form letter informing us that our bid was unsuccessful. I had read that letter twice, filed it quietly, and told myself that we would compete on the next project, that not every contract was ours to win, that the work we were already doing in Cherry was the foundation that would eventually make us unpassable. I had not known that we had been disassembled using information from my own dinner table. I sat across from Zuri in the quiet of my kitchen and felt a particular cold clarity settle through me that I recognized from the moments in construction work when you finally have the complete picture and know exactly what has to happen next. Not rage, I had given myself 2 full days of it in private, in my truck, at the Cherry site, on consecutive Sunday mornings, when no one else was around, and I had let it move through me completely and set it down. What I felt now was the functional stillness of a man who can see the full structure of what has been done and knows precisely what the appropriate response is. She didn't know what he was doing with what she told him, Zuri said. Not a defense. An observation, delivered the way she delivered findings in an audit, because the fact was part of the complete picture, and leaving it out would make the picture inaccurate. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about a woman who had been lonely inside a marriage that had grown silent, who had let someone in because he offered the one thing she was most hungry for, and who had spoken openly about her husband's work without understanding that she was handing the blueprint to someone who intended to use it as a competitive weapon. She was not innocent. Her choices had caused serious damage, and I would not minimize that. But she was also not the sole architect of everything that had been done to me. She had been, in part, the instrument through which someone far more calculated had operated. I called Nasir Cole at 7-Eleven the following morning. He answered on the third ring. Within 30 days, he had filed a civil complaint in Mecklenburg County Superior Court against Marcus Holt and Meridian Development Group on the grounds of tortious interference with business relations and misappropriation of proprietary commercial information. The evidence on Zuri's USB internal email records, meeting logs, and a documentation trail through Meridian's internal communication servers that Dominique had carefully preserved and which Zuri had organized with the precision of a forensic accountant was comprehensive enough that Nasir used the word strong in describing our position, and Nasir Cole was not a man who used that word as a courtesy. The case did not reach a jury. Meridian's legal team contacted Nasir 6 weeks after the filing. They settled for $310,000 and a formal written acknowledgement that Wells Heritage Construction had been improperly disadvantaged in the Cherry Neighborhood project bid process. Marcus Holt resigned from Meridian Development Group 9 days after the settlement was signed. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning, in late June, in a courtroom on East Trade Street, in a proceeding that lasted approximately 40 minutes and involved no raised voices and nothing unexpected. Nasir handled it. Ariana's attorney handled her side. Documents were signed. 9 years of marriage became a set of records filed in a cabinet in a building in uptown Charlotte. I drove home afterward and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the backyard for a while. The fig tree Ariana had planted along the back fence the previous spring was putting out leaves. I looked at it for a long time before I went upstairs to change. The paternity matter was resolved separately through the legal process under Chapter 49 of the North Carolina General Statutes. Marcus Holt was established as the biological father of the child. Legal responsibilities were assigned accordingly. I was removed from the birth certificate. Ariana had not argued when Nasir walked her through what the process would require. She had simply looked at her hands and said, "I know." That was all. I will say something honest about Ariana that I have returned to many times in the months since. She made choices that caused serious damage to me, to my company, to 9 years of shared life. Those choices are real, and they are not made smaller by any surrounding context. But I also know that she was a woman who was deliberately targeted by someone who understood her specific vulnerability and who positioned himself there with calculation and patience she was not equipped to recognize. She was not innocent. She was also not the sole author of everything that happened. The truth sits in both of those places at once, and I have made peace with holding both of them because refusing to hold both would mean refusing to understand what actually happened. I have not spoken to Ariana since the day the divorce was signed, not out of bitterness. Out of the understanding that some structures, once properly decommissioned, should not be reopened. The settlement money arrived in a business account in July. The first $60,000 retired the equipment note that had been sitting on Wells Heritage's books for 2 years. Another 40 hired a second structural engineer, a young woman named Celeste Okafor, 2 years out of NCANT, who turned out to be the most precise reader of historic building specifications I had encountered since my mentor James Bird had taught me the trade in my mid-20s. She asked better questions in her first week than most people I had interviewed, asked in an entire hiring process. The sign went up at the Wells Heritage construction site trailer on a Monday morning in August. A proper sign 2 feet by 4 feet, dark green with white lettering, mounted at the entrance to the Cherry Restoration Project site, where anyone walking the block could read it. The company name had existed on documents and business cards, and the door of my truck for years. This was different. This was visible. I stood in front of it for a while before I went inside to start the day. I met Hannah on a Tuesday afternoon in September at the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library on North Tryon Street. She was in the North Carolina collection, on the 2nd floor, standing at the shelves in the architecture section with a book open in one hand, and the focused frown of a person who is searching for something specific and has not yet found it. I was looking for a technical reference on post-civil war timber construction methods in Piedmont communities. We reached for adjacent books on the same shelf, within 30 seconds of each other, and she glanced over and said, without any preamble at all, "Do you know anything about balloon framing in the 1890s? I've been trying to find a clear explanation for 2 weeks." I did, as it happened. I told her what I knew. We talked in that aisle for 20 minutes, then moved to a reading table by the window and talked for another hour. She was 36 years old and taught 11th grade American history at Garinger High School, and her students were building a semester research project on the architectural history of the Cherry neighborhood. She wanted to understand the technical side of it well enough to actually teach it rather than summarize it from a textbook. She asked precise questions about construction methods and material choices and preservation philosophy, and she listened to the complete answer before she formulated the next question. She did not ask what kind of car I drove or what the company's annual revenue was. She asked, at one point, "What is the oldest structure you've personally worked on?" And when I told her a federal-style row house on Brevard Street, built in 1887, with original heart pine floors that had somehow survived 136 intact years, she looked genuinely delighted in a way that had nothing performed about it. I asked if she would ever want to see the Cherry Project site. She said she would. The following Tuesday, I brought Celeste out to the Cherry site to walk her through the last 2 structures before completion. She spent 40 minutes on the 2nd floor of the Queen Anne home asking questions about the original roof framing system and taking notes in a small spiral notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. At one point, she looked up from the framing and said, "You can tell this was built by someone who expected it to still be standing in 200 years. I told her that was exactly right. She nodded and went back to her notes. That was the beginning of something I was not managing or analyzing or being careful about. I was simply walking toward it the way you enter a space you have not been in before, paying attention, moving without hurry, with your hands open, and your eyes clear. The last structure in the Cherry Restoration Project was completed on a Thursday afternoon in late September, and I was on the roof when the final work was done. I had told the crew to head out early. They had been putting in long days for 6 weeks to hit the completion date, and they had earned the afternoon. By 4:30, I was alone on the rooftop of a restored Queen Anne home on Brevard Street, 3 stories up, looking out at the neighborhood spread below me in the angled gold light of a late September evening. The live oaks along the block threw long shadows across the sidewalk. A woman I did not know walked a small dog past the front gate and glanced up at the building and kept going. A church bell sounded twice from somewhere east. Third Ward Baptist, most likely. The one where half the families in this neighborhood had been marking the significant hours of their lives for the better part of a century. I sat on the edge of the parapet with my hands in my lap and let it settle. 14 years of work visible from where I was sitting. Not just this roof, all of it. The row houses, with their original brick repointed and sealed. The corner building, whose load-bearing walls had been quietly failing for 30 years, until I found the fault and rebuilt them from the interior out. The church fellowship hall, 3 blocks north, that the city had condemned and was now a community meeting space again, full of folding chairs and donated coffee makers and the voices of people who had been fighting to keep this neighborhood alive. Long before I arrived, with my equipment and my drawings, I also thought about a question Nasir had asked me near the end of the divorce proceedings, in his office on a gray February afternoon, with the rain coming sideways against the windows on East Moorhead Street. He had set his pen down and looked at me across the desk and said, not as an attorney, but as a man who had been watching my composure for 8 months. How are you actually doing with all of this? I had sat with the question for a moment before I answered. I'm okay, I said. I'm building something. He had nodded slowly. That's what you do, he said. It was not until I was on this rooftop, with the neighborhood spread below me, and the September light going gold across the old brick and the live oak leaves, that I understood what I had meant by that answer. Not the Cherry Project, not the civil settlement, not the new structural engineer or the company sign, or any of the specific things I had been putting in place since March. Something underneath all of those things. A man returning to the understanding of who he had always been before the years of invisible labor had made him feel that the value of what he built was contingent on whether anyone saw him building it. I had always built things that were meant to last longer than the people who commissioned them. That was the specific nature of restoration work. You were not building for the client. You were building for the neighborhood, for the community, for the children who would grow up in those structures, and the grandchildren who would inherit them. The work was never really about you. It was about the thing you left standing when you were done. That was also, I understood now, the only useful philosophy for the rest of a life. I thought about the Cherry Project bid. About 14 months of preparation, disassembled and used against me by a man who had obtained its contents through my own dinner table. I had been genuinely furious when the full picture came clear in March, not the managed stillness I presented in public, but the real thing, physical and complete, and I had allowed myself to feel it entirely, in private, over 2 long Sunday mornings at the empty job site. Then I had set it down, not because I forgave it easily, because I understood that carrying it forward would cost me more than it would cost anyone else. Post-traumatic growth, the term researchers use for the genuine expansion of a person that sometimes follows devastating loss, is not a comfort. and not a reward for suffering. It does not arrive because you choose it. It arrives when the break opens a space that had been closed, and something more honest grows there. I had lost a marriage and a major contract, and a version of my future I had believed in completely. What I found in the gap was harder to describe but more durable than any of what I had lost, a clarity about what I valued, a trust in my own judgment that had been tested at its outer limits and had not given way, and the specific quiet of a man who did what was right and then let the rest go without needing it to be witnessed. I did not hate Ariana. It had taken some months before I could say that and mean it cleanly. Not because I wanted to protect her from accountability. She had been accountable, legally and otherwise. But because hatred is its own form of invisible labor, the kind that drains the most from the person carrying it and returns absolutely nothing. I had carried enough invisible labor in my life. I was not going to volunteer for more. My phone rang at 6:03. Hannah. I looked at her name on the screen and felt the specific quiet of a man who has set something heavy down after a long time of carrying it and is only beginning to understand, in the absence of the weight, how heavy it actually was. I answered. "Are you still up there?" she asked. I had texted her when I reached the roof, because she had asked me to let her know when the cherry project was finished, and I had gotten into the simple habit of telling her things without calculating whether I was supposed to. "Still up here," I said. "How does it look?" I looked out at the neighborhood, the old trees, the lit windows beginning to appear as the evening came on, the church spire, catching the last September light against a sky that had gone the specific deep gold that only comes at this hour in this season. "Like it's going to be here a long time," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Just long enough." "That's everything you wanted it to be," she said. Not a question. "Yeah," I said. "It is. Here is what I want to ask you to do before this week ends. Not as an obligation, as a deliberate act of care. Find the person in your life who has been showing up without making a production of it, the one who handles the details, the one who keeps the lights on in the background, who takes care of the thing that needed taking care of and does not wait around to be thanked for it. Take 15 minutes, put your phone down, turn the television off, and tell them one specific thing they did that you actually noticed. Not a general appreciation. One moment, the Tuesday they drove you somewhere. The morning they fixed the thing without being asked. The evening they stayed when they could have left. Say it out loud. Before the week is done, the marriages and families that survive are not the ones where no one ever causes damage. They are the ones where people decide, before the silence grows too wide to cross, to say the true thing while there is still time to say it. The most painful part of this story is not the betrayal, or the DNA envelope, or the lawsuit. It is the quieter question underneath all of it. How long had two people been failing to say what needed to be said to each other? And what did that silence eventually cost them both? I have been sitting with this story for a long time. The image I keep returning to is not the ballroom or the courtroom or the settlement check. It is a man on a rooftop on a September evening, looking at 14 years of careful work he built with his own hands, and feeling for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember that the foundation beneath him was solid, that is worth building toward, whatever it costs to get there. Story by Quinn Fun. Character development by Chris Nguyen. Adaptation by David Nguyen. A team that believes every story told honestly does something a little larger than entertain.